Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Happy to be here.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about. It seems like the world is crumbling right before our very eyes. I'd first like to start off with your thoughts on this Ukrainian counteroffensive because we heard so much of it for so long. Well, first it was supposed to be a spring counteroffensive that never materialized. And now it seems as though this is really going nowhere. It's not changing the face of this war. The only thing that's changing is the tally of bodies, sadly, that are piling up on both sides of this war. What are your thoughts on this Ukrainian counteroffensive? Do you expect any breakthroughs? Have you seen anything you would deem a breakthrough? And where do you think this is headed and for how long?
Well, that's a mouthful. I think I can answer some of it very easily. I just received some overhead surveillance material from Ukraine, and the overhead surveillance photographs or pictures show 123,000 freshly dug graves. And the estimate at the bottom of the picture is that 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed thus far.
Wow.
So I think to sum up the counteroffensive is a fairly straightforward affair. It's gone absolutely nowhere. It's achieved nothing. And the sad part is that, and I blame this to some extent on NATO and on the military advice that they've received, particularly from the Americans and the British. Ukrainians have been trying to refight World War II, and they're operating in a fundamentally different environment. I mean, if you listen to Petraeus and the others talk, they say, oh, well, they've mastered combined arms warfare, and they've got this right and that right. The problem is that we live in a different world today, and today the world is as follows. Nothing happens anywhere in eastern Ukraine, or for that matter, even in western Ukraine, but certainly in eastern Ukraine right now where the war is being fought, that the Russians cannot instantly see, that they can't instantly track and ultimately target. The only issue for them is whether they're going to target it or not, and that depends on whether they see it as presenting a threat, and they've got an array of systems with which they can strike. It's not dependent on weather, because the weather doesn't interfere. It's simply a fact of life that the combination of highly improved, high-definition surveillance, whether it's thermal imagery or any number of other types, you can't hide anymore. That's the first thing. So you're operating in an environment where your opponent sees everything. Now, we've provided the Ukrainians with a great deal of information, but I don't think our downlinks to them are as good as what the Russians have. And that's because the Russians have learned over time to link the overhead surveillance, the space-based surveillance, the terrestrial surveillance, with all of their strike systems. So you have near instantaneous identification and decision on whether or not it's going to be targeted. And this runs from the tactical level, which may only involve a mile or two of surveillance, all the way up to strategic surveillance, which reaches hundreds of miles, even 1,000 miles. And so from the very beginning, the Ukrainians have been dealing with this, but they've been dealing with it as though it didn't exist, even though they've learned that the integrated air defenses, which is part of this precision paradigm, has effectively emptied the airways. There's nothing above them. They can't fly. If we were involved in this war, we couldn't fly. We'd lose most of our aircraft. And this is something that people don't understand. I hear American generals say, well, if we just send in B-52s, each B-52 drops 90 500-pound bombs, we'll smash all these defenses. Well, good luck. Because as soon as they're within range of the air defenses, they'll be shot out of the sky. They'll never reach the point. It's a different kind of warfare. The second thing is that the Ukrainians have been focused by us on territory. You've got to drive out the Russians, get that territory back. Well, in reality, the Russians have not been interested in territory. They've been interested in destroying the Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, killing the Ukrainian army. That's the problem. The Ukrainians have not been focused on destroying the Russian army. They've been focused on trying to get back terrain. It's a waste of time. Terrain is only valuable insofar as it gives you an advantage. If there's no advantage to holding it, it doesn't have any value. The Russians understand that from 1,000 years of history of dealing with Mongolian armies and every other conceivable form of warfare, but the Ukrainians haven't learned it. I blame us for that problem. But the bottom line is it's gone nowhere. It's not going to go anywhere. And I think at this point, the Ukrainian army is really broken. And there's a difference between a defeated army and a broken army. You know, the army of Northern Virginia was defeated, but it held together to the bitter end and ultimately was surrendered. It wasn't very large by the time it surrendered, 15, 20,000 men, but it held together and it was surrendered by its leader, Lee, and the war ended. How do you end this war when the leadership no longer really has control over what the forces in the field are doing? The forces in the field are melting away. The resistance is dying out. Why? Because people are tired of dying. We've transformed Ukraine into a graveyard. We've transformed the Ukrainian army into cannon fodder. And we're telling them, go out, launch this attack, get us a few kilometers of terrain. That'll show NATO and our donors that we're still alive. Well, it's insane. Makes no sense. And people in Washington and the NATO capitals are inhumane. This is beyond reason. This is no longer a war. This is just slaughter. And the sooner we understand that, the sooner we can end it. But we're not going to humiliate Russia. We're not going to subjugate Russia. The Russians are not going to bow down for forgiveness. Putin is not going to jail. There will be no regime change. Yeah, this is all crap. And the problem is that we don't seem to understand that they're not the people who are responsible. We are. This could have been over quite early. You'll recall, I'm sure some of your viewers recall, that the Ukrainian negotiating team at the end of March, beginning of April said, yeah, we can live with neutrality, which was the principal concern the Russians have always had. They didn't want a NATO forward operating base on their border designed to attack them. Very simple. Well, that was rejected. And so here we sit. And everyone's convinced the Russians want to march all the way to Warsaw and Berlin. No, they don't. They are not interested in that at all. If they were interested in that, they'd be moving right now on Kiev. I think they're waiting to see what happens next, and then they'll move. But they don't want to govern Ukrainians. They know the Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. Mm-hmm. That was never the point. But now they've secured those areas that are Russian, that have Russians living in them. So they no longer are an oppressed people inside Ukraine. That was the number one consideration. And they're destroying this, they call it the neo-Nazi force. It's certainly a heinous group of people that have done terrible things to Russian prisoners and Russian people, no question about it. But, you know, the Russians have done something very brilliant. They've always treated the Ukrainians that surrendered with great kindness. They have never mistreated the Ukrainians at all. And as a result, the Ukrainian officer looks around, he tries to evacuate the 50 wounded men that he's got. And they say, well, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We can't evacuate them. And so he says, I'm not going to let my men die. Calls the Russians. The Russians say, of course. And this is happening. And it's not a surprise, but this army is broken. It's a broken vessel now. No amount of supplies are going to change that reality.
I mean, from what I've seen, that appears to be the truth. No amount of supplies, no amount of money is going to change the reality. And granted, a lot of those supplies and funds are being siphoned off to Ukrainian, oligarchs and elite. I'm curious, though. No one in the White House, no one in the State Department right now, maybe some in the Pentagon, are really looking for a way out, an off-ramp in this. And I know that's been the discussion all along. Where is the off-ramp? With the candidacy of President Donald J. Trump, someone who you served under as senior advisor to the Pentagon, do you feel hopeful in his plight to end this altercation, this war, within the first 24 hours? Do you think that that's actually possible?
Well, I think a number of things could be done quickly, and he could do them. But right now, his life is a living hell.
Yeah.
And I don't know what happens over the next several months. I mean, I wouldn't want to trade places with him under any circumstances. It's incomprehensible to me that we as a nation allow this nonsense to go on. The nonsense machine in Washington is out of control. But there are a couple of other things that need to be borne in mind. I don't think anybody in the administration, and even people at the top of the Pentagon, really understand that you don't build an army on the fly. You don't just bring in tons of equipment, put a lot of people on it and say, all right, now you're an army. It's ridiculous. It takes a long time to do it. A general officer I served under who's now passed away, he was a very great man. His name was Otis, General Otis, and he once said, the profession of arms is really very, very difficult. Building military power as we're trying to do it, and he was trying back in the early 80s, is very difficult to do it. He said, if it wasn't that tough, we'd contract it out. We don't get it. We've contracted the war out to Ukraine, literally. We've said, here's your stuff, here's cash. We've ignored the corruption. We've ignored the 60, 70,000 children that have gone missing as a result of this war. God knows where they are. We've ignored every conceivable ugly feature of this campaign with one goal in mind. We're going to destroy Russia. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. But for the neocons and the globalists, and they've blended into one cabal right now, this is an existential fight. If Russia survives and flourishes, well, your attempt to destroy the last European power that has a viable national identity, a real national language, a national culture, a history that cannot be rewritten, borders that will not open, that refuses to be assimilated by the rest of the world as opposed to preserving itself, will have been lost. They will have lost the fight. And see, they're looking at West Europe right now in terrible condition, economically, socially, as a huge success story. We've overrun France and Germany and Italy with all of these people from the Middle East and Africa and, Southwest Asia. This is wonderful. We're overrunning the United States. We used to talk about millions from Latin America. Well, they're now in the minority. We have people coming from all over the world. We don't know anything about them. They're unvetted. They're marching into the country unmolested. We hand them a little slip of paper that tells them when they're supposed to show up for their court date. It's a joke. Criminality is brimming. So, we in the West are a big success story for the globalists. And this was their one good shot at destroying the holdout, Russia, which is obviously evil. Now, that's a pretty stiff problem right now to deal with. And I think the way that the administration is trying to do it, and you can see this, Jackson, when you go into the New York Times and some of the other leading newspapers. Well, we've given the Ukrainians everything. There's not much more that we can do now. We've trained them. We've given them this. We've given them that. And I can already hear in the background, well, sorry, we gave you all we could. And, now it's time to turn attention to China. Oh, and by the way, China, that's a really big threat. Russia, well, it's not that big of a deal, but China, that's a really big deal. And nobody will stand up and say, well, if you don't like the fentanyl coming through the Mexican drug cartels into the United States, you don't go to war with China. You close the border.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You fight
Tucker
crime in point. America.
Yeah. I heard Tucker Carlson speak at in Palm Beach a few days ago. He made that point. He's like, how many Americans has Russia killed? 0, approximately, over the past, several decades. What about Mexico through their fentanyl crisis? Tens of thousands every single year. And we don't go to war with them. We simply deal with it through policy and diplomacy. It's just crazy. But you talk about China there. I saw a story just yesterday. The Biden administration is now working to use the legal loopholes they created through this endless taxpayer-funded supply of military arms to Ukraine to now try supply arms to Taiwan, something that they've already been doing, and they've been training Taiwanese special ops in Taiwan, from what I understand, with U.S. troops. How quick do you think that might materialize? Because I know they have their eyes set on China. I remember, I think it was the first conversation we have, I asked you the question, what do you think about this war with China? And you said, war with China is a fundamentally stupid idea. And I don't know how many times I've played that clip on my show because it's so true. That's the last thing I think the American public needs right now.
Well, I don't think we're going to benefit from war with anyone at the moment, especially since the nation is at war with itself. Mm-hmm. We've been in a cold war with the left now for decades. It's now beginning to turn hot. I don't know how hot it's going to get, but that's a far more important fight right now inside the United States than anything happening everywhere else. China is a strange place. We don't understand China. China might as well be on Mars or Jupiter. That's how much we understand the Chinese and their civilization. It's one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. It's the last country in the world that wants to go to war with us. It absolutely does not. There are 1.4 billion of them, perhaps four versions of the United States living inside this place called China. If you go to war with them, oh, they'll fight and they'll defend themselves. And most of their forces and their capabilities are all designed to defend China. No question about it. And you'll end up in a situation where you're sitting outside the largest fortress in human history. And instead of having an equally large and powerful force attacking, you're going to be a Lilliputian force hurling rocks and boulders at this giant fortress and expecting something to change. It's absurd. It's a complete waste of time. Chinese are about business. They're about making money. They have enormous problems with corruption and organized crime. Every morning, I'm sure Xi wakes up and he worries about two things. First of all, how do I hold this monstrous country together? 1.4 billion. We can't even begin to imagine that. Secondly, how do I deal with all the corruption? Every other general in the People's Liberation Army has his own string of factories producing everything from rubber dinosaurs to microcircuits. Good Lord, what do we think these people are about? They recently arrested, they probably executed him. I haven't followed up the man responsible for shipbuilding because the hulls he was building for the PLA had cracks in them. They weren't seaworthy. They've got a submarine fleet. They're trying to catch up with us, but submarine fleets like armies take decades. We have really the finest submarine fleet in the world when it's operating. Right now, 40% of it isn't functional. It's sitting in dry dock, which is not a good thing. And we don't have enough of them, by the way. We need more submarines. We don't need more surface ships because the same capability that can find you on land can find you at sea. So why build these big surface ships? But the submarines, they're vitally important. But the Chinese are fearful of what could happen to them. They're very reluctant to send them very far from Chinese coastlines for fear that they'll sink. So look, the Chinese aren't preparing for a war with us, but yes, they'll prepare to defend themselves. And Taiwan is a very sensitive item. Now, here's some good news. Both of the major parties on Taiwan, one is the old KMT, which is the Chiang Kai-shek's party. Mm-hmm. That party has always, well, I shouldn't say always, but certainly for the last decade, been an advocate for reunification with the mainland. The other party is historically the pro-Japanese party. They were happy under Japanese rule and occupation, would be happy to continue to do so. But they're the ones that were talking about independence. Guess what? They've dropped it from their platform because they've been losing all of the elections in Taiwan because the population doesn't want a war with China. And people point to the microcircuitry that's produced on Taiwan, which is of exceptionally important capability for all of us. Well, they sell to China, to South Korea, and to Japan, as well as to us. Nobody wants to destroy that factory. Nobody. Now, Donald Trump very wisely wanted to build a similar factory in the United States and bent over backwards to bring the people from Taiwan that own it over here. Of course, as soon as Biden came in, that deal went down the toilet. And that's unfortunate because that was the right answer. Yeah. We need to reinvigorate our manufacturing, especially our high-end manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing. That's something that needs to happen. We're not doing it. We're busy trying to change the human composition of our armed forces to ensure that we have a majority of people who are not white and lots of women. And of course, that is vitally important to the security of this country. And how many R's are there in fat chance?
Yeah, it's insane. Someone with the ideas you had, and I talked about this with Robert Barnes on my program. God, I wish you could be on that ticket with Donald Trump. I really wish. I don't know if that's anything you'd ever even consider, but I really wish.
No, Jackson, I appreciate it. It's very nice of you to say that, but I have no wish to run for office. And, look, my whole life has really been focused on the profession of arms and the military. That's where I'm most comfortable. It's because of that that I became so interested in foreign policy, because I was interested in what happened in the rest of the world. I never really wanted to wield power in domestic politics. I really don't. So, any America First government that comes to power, whether it's RFK Jr. or Donald Trump or anybody else, I'm happy to serve in it.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't seek public office. People that want public office want power. I'm not really interested in that as much as I am in our country's security.
Well, I think you do a fine job, either wherever you land. I think you'll do a fine job. One question that has been on the minds of a lot of my viewers recently is everything that's unfolding, almost like a new Cold War. It's appearing to be in West Africa. We recently saw a coup in Niger. And now you have all these, I believe it's referred to as ECOWAS, which is like the band of West African states. Some of them are still pro-Western, some of them not, due to recent military coups and military juntas that have taken control, like in Burkina Faso, for example. But Russia has a lot of ties to these nations like Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and of course, the new government in Niger. And Niger is now talking about bringing in Wagner forces all throughout the country. That was just reported on a few hours ago. They had a meeting in Mali yesterday. Do you foresee even a possibility of something unraveling there, like widespread fighting and war taking place between Western and Russian-backed powers in West Africa?
Well, most of Africa, tragically, is not a great place to live. It's very sad. And when they first created this thing called Africa Command, I was still on active duty. And I had the misfortune to open my big mouth in a room full of generals and others and say, what the hell are we calling this place Africa Com for? Africa Command? Are you crazy? If you were an African, what would you think about the United States if it created a military organization called Africa Command? I said, I'd be offended. So whatever you do, don't call it Africa Command. Well, obviously, I had a big impact. I was invited to leave, and I was not invited back to any more of those meetings. Look, Africa is a difficult place. The French portions that you're talking about in Northwest Africa have been called Afrique du Nord. This is a famous area that the French have dominated in imperial times, and they've dominated it since then, certainly in many ways, linguistically and culturally. The problem is that the Africans resent it. They've never felt as though they were given a square deal when it came to independence from France, because the French stipulated in all of the agreements certain French interests had to be protected and receive special treatment. And the French army is renowned for going wherever French interests are at stake, business interests, and the Africans are fed up with it. And so this is an example in Niger where a supposedly U.S.-backed government with a U.S.-trained military suddenly turned around and said, I think all of you white people need to get out of here. We've had it with you. Go away. Go. Europeans, leave. The Russians, haven't done business that way. The Russians, in fact, Putin recently forgave $23 billion of debt owed to Russia by many of these countries in sub-Saharan and some of Saharan Africa. I mean, it was never going to be paid back. You had a much better shot of profiting if you just forgave it, turned back the clock to zero and started over, which is what he's done. We would benefit from doing similar things in many parts of the world. In fact, we would benefit enormously if we simply admitted that we can't go on with the enormous sovereign debt that hangs over our heads, but nobody will do that. The point is, I think it had less to do with the Russians or the Chinese and simply to do with the anger and frustration that built up for a long time towards colonialism. And the Africans said enough. We should say, fine, good luck. And then we ought to question what we're doing in all of these places with military power. If you want to go into these places, by all means, look for business, compete on the business level, but get out of this militarized foreign policy. It's a loser.
Fair points. Fair points. I couldn't agree more. Going back to Ukraine, I'd love to catch your thoughts on the recent developments with an American Chilean journalist YouTuber, Gonzalo Lira. I don't know if you've had conversations with him in the past. Are you familiar with his case?
Yes, I watched a couple of programs that he created and then broadcasted from Kharkov, which is where I think he and his family were living.
Hmm.
And I thought he was very important because he was telling the truth. And he was telling people from the very beginning, the Russians really aren't losing. Ukrainians are losing. The Russians are deliberate, they're methodical, and they're dealing with a problem. And we really ought to find a solution to this, but stop running around and pretending that the Russians are losing. And that was pretty much what I was getting from my contacts on the ground. And I watched yesterday as a spokesman for the State Department was asked specifically about Gonzaga Lira, and he pretended to act as though, first of all, who are you talking about? And secondly, well, I don't know if any of that's true. I think what we're seeing is that the same disregard for the safety of an American citizen in Ukrainian hands is what we see with regard to the victims of criminality in New York, Washington, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, wherever, especially if they're white, especially if they're Northeast Asians. We don't care about you. And I think that's what the administration is saying. It's a terrible thing to say, and I'm sure not everybody in the administration agrees with that. But whether they agree with it or not, that's the Biden, Blinken, Merrick Garland message to the world and to us.
I guess I just don't understand the. I guess maybe that's the whole point. It's not to be understood, but the premise of sending $200 billion, maybe, I mean, who knows how much at this point we've sent to Ukraine, and now they're disappearing people like Gonzalo Lira. I mean, he tried to flee over to the Hungarian side of the Ukrainian border, and we don't know where he is. We've seen some reports claiming that he was wrapped up again by ASBU. Some reports claim he's on the run. I just failed to comprehend how this is even a possibility for our government, but this is the new America, right?
Well, let's be honest. If President Biden turned to his cabinet and he said, I want this man released immediately, I'm sure that our friend Gonzaga Lira would be on a plane tomorrow morning. There's no doubt about it. Ukraine is a creature of U.S. foreign policy. We pay for its government. We pay for virtually everything. And we've certainly turned in Zelensky and many of his inner circle into multimillionaires with estates and residences all over the world. So if we said, listen here, we've had enough of this nonsense, we want this man released, he'd be out. But you'll remember this basketball player, I think her name was Grange or something like that.
Yeah, Brittany Griner.
Yeah, Griner, I'm sorry. And she was released. And at the same time, we had a man in Russian custody who was convicted of espionage. He was, I guess, in the State Department, but had been engaged in espionage. He was a former Marine, I think, who had seen action in the Marine Corps. And there was an interesting commercial. Well, it was really a commercial. It was a show, one of these talk shows in Russia. And the discussion was the American government leaves no stone unturned to bring home this woman who has publicly denounced the United States, poured nothing but buckets of filth and abuse all over the American people, but they'll do anything to retrieve her and bring her back to the United States, and fine, we're happy to be rid of her. But look, here's an American patriot that we're holding in prison. And that's what they called him. He's an American patriot. He broke our laws, but that he is an American patriot. And what's wrong with him? And then, they would start, well, he's white. He's a man. He was in the military. If Americans haven't figured out what's going on in this country, well, maybe they should watch Russian TV because they'll find out. And they were telling the truth. It doesn't make any sense. It is the antithesis of everything that we in this country, I think, have been trying to build for decades. We've tried to build a society with equality for everyone before the law, not equality of outcome, not special privileges for anybody, simply equality before the law. And this rule of law has separated us from everybody in the world. That's why we were such a success story in business and economics. But that doesn't seem to be on the agenda these days for the Biden administration.
Definitely not. Definitely not. After I watched that new interview with Tucker Carlson and the Hunter Biden business associate, I mean, definitely not there. It's clear. It's just rank corruption left and right everywhere in this administration. But that, again, not really a surprise. Um, One of my friends, Daniel Burke, he had a good question for you that I can't wrap my head around. Maybe you can. Question is, how can the crumbling US economy be rescued in the context of the rise of BRICS and BRICS nations as they continue to expand and grow? Can we eliminate Wall Street and City of London control over our economy in light of this?
Your friend has hit the principal nails right on the head. The first thing is, I don't consider myself an expert, but I do listen to others who are. One of those is Nassim Taleb, who tried to point out a few weeks ago to a rather unreceptive audience on MSNBC that we were headed into something at least as bad as what happened in 2008 and probably a lot worse. And they said, well, you know why? He said, well, it's because we tried to use monetary policy to fix a structural problem. In other words, we tried to use monetary policy to conceal the debt problem instead of dealing with the serious debt issue and how over leveraged we are as a country. We decided, forget it. We didn't address any of the issues you and I have talked about in terms of repatriating industry, manufacturing, re-energizing, reinvigorating the energy sector. These are obvious things. The agrarian sector. These are America's great advantages in the economic business, and we've done the opposite. We've tried to beat them into submission or drive them into the ground. And he said, under the circumstances, I don't see anything changing. And they said, well, how does it change? He said, well, it won't change without any pain. We're going to have real pain. And most of the pain is going to be up in Wall Street. Go back and remember what Sheila Bair had to say when we went through all of this in 2008. She was talking specifically about Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac and these enormous bailouts that were arranged between the Bush and Obama crowd for all of their friends on Wall Street and so forth. And she said, well, you want to bail people out? How about 10 cents on the dollar? What's this 100% bailout for people that have done a poor job of managing everything? And if it's not only a poor job of management, maybe it's a certain amount of deceit that borders on criminality. She was right. Sheila Bair was 100% on target. Well, here we sit. We're about to go through something at least that bad, according to Nassim Taleb. Now, that has to be juxtaposed against another problem, and that is what you talked about with the BRICS and Russia, China, India, the major powers outside of Europe and North America. This is the problem of going to a gold-backed currency. And I would tell everyone, look up Alasdair Macleod. He is a brilliant economist who's talking about this movement, steady movement led by Moscow towards gold-backed currency. Well, that's anathema to us. And of course, the Federal Reserve goes into, hyperdrive when you mention gold-backed anything. Remember Bernanke, who testified and said, when he was asked, why do banks still hold gold if it's worthless? And he said, well, it's a tradition. Come on. Bernanke and Yellen, the rest of these people, we weren't all born yesterday, maybe last night, but not yesterday. So we do understand gold has real value. And we're in a hell of a fix right now because once this takes off, and I think it will, it'll take time, but it's going to de-dollarize the planet. And our dollar is already weakened. And I don't see how we come through this without a serious crisis here at home. But again, to go back to Nassim Taleb, he's right. Schumpeter used to talk about the unavoidable necessity of creative destruction in the marketplace. In other words, some corporations, firms, businesses have to fail. Others prosper. It's the nature of the marketplace. That's going to happen here. We're going to have some creative destruction in the economy. I think it will also be matched in the political sector.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. It's difficult times, no doubt. We've got ourselves into a pickle. Another country that has themselves in a pickle, to be frank, right now, is Poland. The Polish are very worried about this Wagner threat that is supposedly near their border, on their border. I can't tell if this is all, I mean, I know there's Polish elections that are coming up soon. I can't tell if this is all, fear mongering in an effort to try and actually get the current apparatus reelected in Poland, or if this Wagner threat, this Wagner group threat in Belarus, is actually something that could materialize into a real threat for Polish sovereignty and spark some bigger, issue for the world as a whole. Considering Poland is a NATO member, what do you think is really happening here? Ever since the Prigozhin mutiny and Wagner was exiled to Belarus.
Well, I'm going to try and speak over the laughter in the Kremlin. It's becoming deafening over here. The Poles are wonderful people. I like them. I grew up with a number of them. They are sort of hopeless romantics. And they were a leading power in the world from about 1459 until 1794. And they then vanished. They vanished for reasons that had a lot more to do with them and their own internal problems, much as our own, than with anything else. And they've been trying to get back to 1794 or earlier ever since. I don't think that's going to happen right now, nor do I think it's necessary for Poland. But that's why you've heard the Poles say things that are vile and hateful about Russia, and also make ridiculous assertions about the military power that Poland disposes over and how, together with Lithuania and others, they could take on Moscow. The Polish population, my impression is, and I saw a poll that said 52% of Poles agree that Ukraine should be supported, but the same 52% say we don't want to be in the war. So if that's true, that's an important turning point. I think the government needs to pay attention to that. They have elections in the fall. And there's some evidence from Poland that perhaps the government thinks that if they can march into Western Poland and stake out some terrain as Ukraine collapses, that that'll somehow or another keep them in power. There's another school of thought that says, well, if they go over there, they're going to be annihilated by the Russians. And that'll be the end of the Polish government. They'll be thrown out of office. Or perhaps the Poles hope that if they go over there and they're slammed by the Russians, that we'll rush in to rescue them. I mean, I don't know which of those is the most likely course of action. I hope the most likely course of action is forget it, we're not going. I hope somebody in Washington is telling them, don't even think about it. Mm-hmm. It's not a good idea. We want an end to the war. But as you point out, no one seems to be interested in ending this war. We keep deluding ourselves. Oh, we're winning. Putin is lost. He doesn't know what to do. I don't know, what they're feeding the president in the White House, but whatever it is, the whole White House, from my standpoint, is beginning to look a lot like Weekend at Bernie's. It doesn't make any sense. It's delusional nonsense, and somebody ought to stop it. But, we're not in government. We're not in authority, and Washington is a bubble. So a friend of mine who was in the Spanish army that worked for me, very fine officer, Spanish general staff officer, said, Douglas, the United States is not a country. It's a planet. And he wasn't wrong. We live on our own planet in many ways, and that can be very good in some ways and very bad in others. And right now, Washington is clearly on another planet. It needs to come back down to earth and deal with reality.